Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $12,704 for line number 41 as printed in the sponsor recommends column with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation, Mrs. Belmonte?
Finance Committee recommends.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. On the motion, which is for $12,704 for line item number 41, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly, line item 42 this time.
42, okay. Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $49,687 for line number 42 as printed in the sponsor recommends column with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation, Mrs. Belmonte?
Finance Committee recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Mr. Pasquale.
John Pasquale. We just gave a director a couple of $1,000s earlier. I'd like to have an explanation what the person does in this job, because I see a lot of things here. I'd like to have a description what this job really is.
Mr. Daly.
I'll do the best I can on my feet. This, by the way, this change in line 42 reflects the cost of paying substitutes for not only our Elder Services bus driver, but also for our Elder Services director. Those people have been replaced in past years with volunteers who are taking on a certain amount of responsibility and liability that I feel it's appropriate to pay them for.
Right.
That's the change here.
Now I'd like to follow up because...
Excuse me, Mr. Pasquale, I don't think that Mr. Daly is quite finished answering your question. So why don't you let him finish?
I shall.
With respect to the duties and role of this particular position, the person who works in this position is responsible for establishing, designing, maintaining, and managing, as well as running, in most cases, all the various events and services that are given to the local elderly population. One of the things that comes out in each of the selectmen's budget workshops every year on this particular budget is that even though the town spends, in this case, about $69,000 of its own money for these services through the efforts of our Elder Affairs Director, we realize an additional $251,000 in-kind services as well as monetary contributions that go to fund various small programs for our elders.
See, you used the word substitutes. That's what concerns me. So let me tell you, I don't object to this, but if substitutes get on buses with elderly people in this town, I want to ask the question, are we covered by insurance, God forbid something happens?
Yes. So are they.
Any further discussion? Mr. Piero.
One simple question, Mr. Daly. At the end of the town government meeting, are we going to read red or black? Are we going to end it with the red or the black? Can you calculate the figures?
Well, I'll repeat what the Finance Committee, I will utter what the Finance Committee would say to you at this point, and that's that the budget, as they would say, is $30,000 in the red at this point in time. As I would say, it requires an additional $30,000 of stabilization to be used in order to keep it in the black going into next year. The alternative to that is that some $30,000 reduction in an appropriation somewhere would have to occur in order to erase that deficiency.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, the motion before us is $49,687 for line item number 42. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly for line item 43.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $19,775 for line number 43, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Belmonte.
Finance Committee recommends.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. On the motion, which is $19,775 for line item 43, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Line item 44, Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $19,351 for line number 44, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Belmonte.
Finance Committee recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. The motion is $19,351 for line item 44. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly on line item 45.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $26,250 for line number 45, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
Heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Belmonte.
Finance Committee recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly on line item number 46.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $137,899 for line number 46, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Belmonte.
Finance Committee recommends.
Is there any discussion? Hearing none. The motion is for $137,899 for line item 46. On the motion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly on line item 47.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $48,356 for line number 47, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation?
Finance Committee recommends.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. The motion before us is $48,356 for line item number 47. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Line item 48, Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $13,000 for line number 48, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Belmonte.
Finance Committee recommends.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, the motion is for $13,000 for line item 48. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Line item 49, Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $12,000 for line number 49, as printed in the Sponsor Recommends column, with any noted transfers as printed in the warrant.
You've heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Holsing.
Finance Committee recommends.
You've heard the Finance Committee recommendation. Is there any discussion? Hearing Mr. O'Brien.
Somebody please tell me why you proposed requested $37,000
Mr. Daly, the question is why were $37,000 requested and we're now down to $12,000? What was the extra $25,000 supposed to be for?
The additional expenses there are all going to be paid for from user fees that will be generated by the recreation operation during the ensuing year. There's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison here because, as you may recall, in the last 2 years we've appropriated, I think, $13,000 for recreation. And the numbers that you see in here for FY92 and FY91, which total $21,625 for FY91 and $30,824 for FY92, those totals represent what was actually spent on recreation. All but $13,000 in each of those years came from user fees. So even though the request here for FY93 is $57,000, what we tried to show you, and maybe we didn't explain it clearly in our narrative here, we tried to show you what we expect that budget to be, 25,000 of which is going to be generated by tax revenue. The balance is going to come from user fees.
Any further discussion? Mr. O'Brien.
I don't think I got an answer to my question.
The question, I believe, was where the extra $25,000 were.
Under expenses, fiscal year 93 requested for $37,720, being recommended for $12,000. And I was asking why that discrepancy. What was wanted for $37,000? You having users being in place.
Well, what did...
Fiscal 92, which is $12,042, and then the request is for another $25,000. Want to know why that request was requested.
Mr. Daly.
Okay, that request includes... Do you want to try that?
Ms. Mullen.
Capital expenses is up later, and the other 25,000 is in there between 13 the salaries and 12 expenses. So basically, recreation will be funded, everything we've asked for, if we approve with this 12,000.
So you make it as one request. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. The motion before us is $12,000 for line item number 49. On the motion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Line item 50, Mr. Daly.
Mr. Moderator, I move to appropriate the sum of $7,480 for line number 50.
Huh?
That's the end of the motion.
The motion is different from what is in your printed warrant. The motion is for $7,480 for line item number 50. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Belmonte.
Finance Committee recommends.
Mr. Daly.
The explanation for the difference in numbers is very straightforward. This was simply a misprint. We apologize.
Okay. Any further discussion? Hearing none. The motion is $7,480 for line item number 50. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. Mr. Daly, line item 51.
Point of information.
Point of information. Sir, please state your name and your point of information.
Will this vote be budget out of balance by the end of 20?
Was that anticipated?
Mr. Daly.
The answer is yes. That increases the imbalance by about $3,300, I think it is. So it's about $33,000 now. The misprint was that this $7,000 amount was intended to be in